Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening to everyone. Firstly, thank you, Mr. Jafri, for the introduction, and thank you to Madinah Institute of Leadership and Entrepreneurship for organizing such incredible webinars. I've listened to quite a few in the past, and I'm really impressed with the kind of work that you're actually doing. So well done and congratulations. Secondly, a very warm welcome to all of you wonderful participants. I trust that you're all feeling very energized late this afternoon, and I'm really looking forward to some very good interaction with you after my presentation. I know it's graveyard session, so I'll try and keep my presentation as short as possible, hoping for more interaction from yourself. So let's actually begin the afternoon. As you can see, the topic in front of you is mastering the language of influence. Now, many of us know and understand that being in business and being in such senior and leadership positions, one of the biggest problems many of us have is experiencing poor communication. So when we look at poor communication, it is today's #1 problem at work, at home, and even at world at large. So whether it be between the spouses at home, whether it be between leader and employee, there's always a problem between communication. We find that discords among people are very frequent, and this can range from small annoyances like 5-minute phone calls to email messages which has red underlying capital letters. Many of us are very aware of those. We see it coming in. And just think about the emotions that even the non-verbal communication inflicts within ourselves. And I think we've all experienced that, and some of us are probably smiling through the actual screen at the moment. This also extends to lifelong parent-child resentments. So there's always poor communication and many discords in that as well. Those of us who are parents will understand exactly what I'm talking about at the moment. And then, of course, looking around the world, looking at what is happening in our world right now in today and within the region of the Gulf and every other region, is the conflicts between nations. And we find that a lot of the times, and in fact many of the times, it's being considered that poor communication can be one of the root causes of many of these areas. So in my 22 years of experience in business, and as Mr. Jafri told you, in almost 17 years as a CEO and founder of Training Excellence International Training Institute, I have learned on various different areas of communication, and I've learned how to apply it in various concepts. And this is what I'd like to share with you today. So in order for us to influence or get people to act, we need to understand not only how we communicate with others, but also how they interpret that communication in either what we call an action, getting them to do things, or an inaction for that matter. So where we ask people or we request for things to be done, and as leaders, senior managers, we expect it to be done. But they either do it or they don't. And the question always arises is why? So what I'd like to 30 to 40 minutes, I'll be sharing with you a few motivational traits which we can concentrate on as to how to influence behavior. Now, if you look at the history of these motivational traits, it comes far back to NLP, which we're going to discuss very briefly. But more importantly, the whole communication is going to be about how do we as leaders, senior executives, are able to establish a deep level of what anyone can be, from our children to our spouses, to our colleagues, our friends, our social people that we interact with, and right up to the people that we look up to in the work environment. So in other words, how are we able to use powerful language in our daily functions, whether it be for all of you who are salespeople that are out there and to interact with your customers. How do you actually interact as a salesperson with the customer based on their needs? What kind of language is going to stimulate their needs for them to say, yes, I want to buy your product? Or, yes, give me more information which will allow me to buy your product. For those that are HR recruiters that are probably on the line, or those of you who are in the HR profession, we know that one of our main job functions within HR is to recruit the right best possible candidate for the actual job. And in order to do that, we need to be able to match the job description in terms of what competencies the actual candidate has. Now, in order to do that, we have to question the candidates to identify what competencies will match our actual job. And if we don't do that correctly, there are huge consequences to that, which I will also mention a little later in the seminar. Then, of course, we look at leadership. Most of you are leaders in various organizations, have to deal with employees. There are certain tasks that we would like our employees to be able to do in order for them to show good performance and for us to increase in our productivity in the organization. And when we increase in productivity, we are improving various areas and, of course, increasing our profits. And, of course, one of the most important things is most organizations want to look at is how do we actually decrease costs. So if our communication is not being done effectively, then of course it's very difficult for us to decrease cost. It's very difficult for us to improve performance. It's difficult for us then to also increase productivity. And therefore, we have major communication issues. So let us move into, for example, what are the objectives of today? So firstly, what we're going to look at is understanding people's preferences and influencing them with the language you use for maximum impact. And when we talk about preferences, I'll refer to quite a bit of NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming. Then, of course, we're going to look at how do we establish a deep level of rapport and communicate effectively with anyone. When I say anyone, it doesn't just mean in a work environment or work context. The kind of tools that I will introduce to you towards the end of the program will show you that these tools can change according to the context that you're actually using. And one particular tool is only defined only for the work environment in the context of work. And then, of course, lastly is using powerful language in various areas. However, particularly I want to stress a bit more on the interview process, because many of us within the region, outside, are looking at recruiting people on a daily basis. And as you know, one of the biggest cost indicators for HR is a bad hire. Statistics actually shows that bad hires can cost a company up to about 4 times the person's annual salary. So if you look at a senior executive, and many of us who are senior executives and those of you who are recruiting, you know what those packages are. And if you take that, we talk on average it is 4 times the person's annual salary, but of course it can be much more than that depending on the person that you actually hire. So we need to look at ways of how do we get the right person for the actual job. And those are the 3 main areas that I'll be looking at specifically for today. So when we actually look at the founders, let's look a bit of history of when we look at the founders of NLP, which is the neuro-linguistic programming. NLP is an approach, firstly, to communication. It's a methodology or a program which allows us to approach communication, personal development, and psychotherapy. This was created by Richard Bandler and John Grindler in California. Now, their teachings is widespread. You will find lots of reading material, a lot of educational material about NLP. My discussion today is not going to be so much about NLP, but I would recommend for you to get some background on it whenever you're deciding to move ahead with this kind of a program. However, just to give you a brief summary, they speak about the way we naturally delete, distort, and generalize information. In other words, when we receive information or when we give information out, we filter that information. And we filter it through certain programs within ourselves, which is what is known as meta programs. So we have inside our mind, which is our internal world, and we store memories, experiences, and knowledge, which is based on things that happen in our life. When we actually look at that, you will find that we receive information into our mind. We naturally delete this information. We either distort it or we generalize it. So for those of you who have always heard, whenever you've given somebody a short story about an incident and they went and told somebody else that story, you might find that the person might have summarized your story to such an extent, which is your story that took you 5 minutes might take them only a minute to tell. And I think we all experienced that in many games that we played when we were younger, like Broken Telephone as an example. And this is what we actually talk about, is people deleting information from whatever you've told them, or they've distorted it in a completely new message. And I smile when I think back of the games that we played, like Broken Telephone, and I received a message which was very funny compared to the original message that we actually got. Or sometimes we find that people actually generalize the information. And a lot of this is actually done inside their own internal world, based in terms of how people react to the information that they're receiving, in terms of what do they like about it, or what do they prefer about it, and what they don't. So we all perceive the world around us differently, and this perception is sometimes known as what we call in NLP the map of the world. So in the next slide, which I will now show you in terms of what we look at effective communication, you will see that communication is not only about what you see on the screen, which is a hearing, but it is also in terms of what you look at, which is understanding. So when a person, you give some information to somebody, they hear you, but they also need to understand what you're saying. And if you take this a step further through what we're talking about with meta programs, is it's not just about them talking back after they've understood. Some of the times we want them to act upon what we have asked them to do, especially if it was a request or a task from a leader or a request from a parent to a child. So the action is what is the biggest trigger. And the question is that communication, knowing that it's not only hearing, not only understanding, but it includes understanding the inner and the outer world of every person, which will help to trigger that action. Now, many of us, we allow people to hear, to understand, to ask questions, but we don't test to see whether the action is actually doing what we have asked them to do. So the question is then asked is, for us to guarantee effective communication, how do we get them to act? And that's the basis of the influencing language, is the kind of language that we use in order to get them to act. So if you look at, for example, getting a few of the definitions out of the way, Raymond Chandler once said that ability is what you are capable of doing. Now, if you look at ability, it's what you're actually doing. It's putting you into action. Motivation, on the other hand, determines what you do. So, in other words, if I'm able to do something, I might not do it because I don't have the motivation behind myself doing it. So when we look at motivation, it determines what you do, whether you're capable of doing it or not. So you might have an employee who is very capable of doing a task, but if he's not motivated enough to do it, you will find that he will not act. And then, of course, comes the third area of what Raymond Chandler says, is that attitude determines how well you do it. Now, if you look at the teachings in terms of the meta programs that we're going to look at, it looks specifically at the two that I'm going to talk about today, which is motivation and attitude. Unfortunately, because of time, we can only restrict it to the motivational factors, and I'll be discussing at least 5 of those factors with you today. But if you just summarize these 3 areas, ability is what you are capable of doing, so whether you are able to do it or not is your ability. The motivation is, do you want to do it or not? Do you have the motivation behind doing it? And of course, the attitude is how well you're going to do it. With what kind of behavior and attitude are you going to do it? So it's very important for us to identify those 3 areas before we even move on to looking at how people are influenced. Because if we believe people are influenced by just giving them the skill and teaching them how to do something, which is the ability, then we will be sadly mistaken, because that's not going to influence people. We have to look further than that. Where many training providers actually go wrong, and many companies, in terms of organizations thinking about training analysis for their staff, is that they look at training as a pill. And we look at training as a pill to say, well, you know what, he's not communicating well, so let's teach him how to communicate. And they send everybody on these wonderful communication courses. Whereas if we look deeper, if we treat training as a pill, all we're doing is treating a symptom. And we're not treating the real cause of why people don't communicate effectively, or why people are trying to communicate, but there is no action because of the communication. And therefore, the urge is that we analyze it further by looking at what determines people to actually act, the motivation, and what determines how well they actually act on it, and that's their attitude. So if you look at, there are many tests currently that we look at from how to test whether people have the motivation or whether they have the ability or whether they have the attitude. Now at the moment you will find I won't be talking to you about the test, but rather towards the end I will introduce them to you. But to create the link, you have to understand that yes, there are tests available. Some of them are psychometric tests which have been explained or created in terms of looking at the differences that causes communication problems. So yes, we can go online, we can get in some psychometric tests that are done. We have various programs that many of you are familiar with. But often what we find is that some of these tests places people into certain boxes and it labels them. And some people do, however, identify themselves very differently from those labels. With rather inherent flexibility, which tells them that they need to shift their thinking and behavior as situation changes. And some of those boxes doesn't allow you to change or shift. So what we're going to look at today is how do we look at certain tests which doesn't fit you into those boxes, number one. And number two, identify and acknowledge that people can shift their thinking preferences. And they can shift their behavior if they are counseled and coached and trained effectively. We find that Roger Bailey, who's the founder of a very exciting tool called the Language and Behavior Profiling Tool, the LAB tool, he just did that because he worked with the founders of NLP's meta programs and he designed a tool to identify people's thinking preferences. Now we're going to look at that briefly and then look at how to use that tool in order to influence people with language according to their actual meta program that suits them. So every one of us on this webinar have certain patterns which describes our habitual style. For example, of how we notice things around us, people, how do we notice things. It also looks at our habitual style of our thinking patterns in terms of how we think through ideas, how we make decisions, how we express our feelings or thoughts, how we express our values and sort our preferences. For example, I personally, when I did the test, I was quite surprised that I actually realized I make decisions best by obtaining feedback from people. And these are people that I particularly trust, or even from reports or success stories. A perfect example is recently I had to visit a hospital for a very close friend of mine, and I needed to find out what's the best hospital to take them to. So immediately my first reaction was to run to the internet, we know Dr. Google, and search in hospitals within Dubai, within Sharjah, within the area that you're actually in, and we type out the area and it comes up with the website. But the very first thing I surprised myself while doing was going to the feedback and looking at what other people had to say about those particular hospitals. Did they like it? Did they enjoy their experiences? And immediately I was convinced, that's the hospital I'm going to go to. Despite instinctively I knew that there were hospitals just down the road from where I was and where I lived. Why could I not take my friend there? I didn't want my instinctive reaction to trigger in. I trusted feedback from others. So that tells you a little bit about my preference as to how I relate to others. Now, knowing that preference can be very beneficial to somebody who knows or wants to sell a product for me, to me for an example. So on the other hand, you'll find that when a salesperson, for example, approaches me and he wants to me to make a decision on a product, and he expects an answer immediately. I personally, because of the preference, I resort to fleeing, because I find that I'm uncomfortable with this. This is not what I want. I need to think about it. I need to go and do some research. And in that case, that salesperson not understanding my preference might just make me flee. So I need to go back and consult, look at reports, look at statistics. On the other hand, if the salesperson provided me with more stats or told me who else bought the product and what the results was, I might not have fled so easily. I might have still entertained him further and most likely even bought the product because it met my preference and my style. So in a nutshell, when we're looking at NLP, these preferences are what we call meta programs. They are the basis of our strategies that we choose and the roles we actually play. They reflect our values. They come to value a very particular way of the way we think, and we devalue its opposite. But what's interesting and something that you need to understand is that these meta programs particularly is applicable in terms of the area in which you're at. So for example, I have a different thinking preference at home as I would in my career. My thinking preference in my career is to be able to be very much external and get people's feedback. Where at home, I'm very internal. If I make a decision, then that becomes my own decision. So you have to understand that it is very much particular to the area of interest in context of what you're actually looking at. So context is the key word that we need to understand. So when we look at what is the language of influence, it is the language that creates the least resistance and creates most agreement when talking to people. So if you look at those two keywords on your screen that's highlighted, the least resistance. When we're trying to influence people, we don't want to let them resist easily. For salespeople, it's something that you would work towards quite a bit. And of course, you would like the most agreement when you're actually talking to those particular people. So in terms of learning these influencing techniques, there are two things we need to get out of it. One is, for ourselves, it's a self-awareness goal. For me personally, when I first came across it a few years ago, I found that it helped me open up my mind in terms of how I understand what my own motivators are and what my own attitudinal patterns were. So in other words, what made me do what I wanted to do and what attitude or how well I actually did it in terms of those two patterns. So how these patterns influence our motivation and emotions and behavior. And when we know that, we are able to more accustomed to change to that particular situation or scenario because we know how we normally react. In other words, we know what our hot buttons are. We know what triggers us, and it allows for more open communication. The other objective, of course, is to be able to enhance and trigger other people's hot buttons, and that allows for a performance goal. So whether you're a parent, whether you're a leader, whether you're an HR consultant, whether you're a salesperson, you'll find those four arenas of examples that you use is looking for performance goals from the people that you are communicating with. So to explore how understanding motivational and attitudinal patterns can help, we maximize the positive potential of the individual in a given context. And again, notice we're using the word in a given context because you'll find that your trait, your motivational trait and your working trait will change in every context of your life. In terms of building rapport, when we talk about, let's look at the first area of our objective is how do we actually build rapport? And I'd like to look at building rapport through the meta programs. Now, a very good friend, I would rather say Abraham Lincoln, and I call him a friend, and the reason is because there's so many sayings and motivational things that he's actually said, which allows us to be able to look back and look at what rapport actually is. And the one thing in particular that stands out for me is if you would win a man to your cause, first convince him that you are his sincere friend. Now, let's analyze that. If you want to win somebody over, in other words, in the work environment, if you would like him to do a task for you, we need to convince that person that you are his sincere friend. Now, we're not talking about going up to people and letting them like you and it's fake. I'm talking about genuinely, because in the work environment, we're all focused on productivity. And productivity means that let's find the best possible way for us to actually work forward. And if we have to work towards something, then how can we do it working side by side? And that's what we talk about, is convincing people that you are their sincere friend. So in looking at that, I want us to consider, for example, two categories of fighting or a sport that we're all familiar with. One particularly is Aikido, which is martial arts Aikido, and the other is boxing. And let's look at the difference of those and relate that to what rapport is. If we look at boxing, you'll find that boxing is a quicker and more effective way of how people actually work. It's opposed to force and force. So you have somebody boxing with each other, and there's a force going against each other. Whereas if you look at the Oriental martial art Aikido, which teaches you to align yourself with the incoming force and redirect it. There's a famous actor that we're all familiar with, Steven Seagal. And if you watch most of Steven Seagal's movies as an example, you will see that he has an art of using Aikido. And it's a very calming effect where he moves with and he aligns himself with his opponent, and he aligns himself with the incoming force, and then he redirects it. Where versus the opposite of the boxing, where boxing, for example, is opposed force with force, which is the model of boxing. You find that it is a far quicker and more effective way when using Aikido, because you aligning yourself and with the incoming force and you're redirecting it. Now, the same holds true for communication. When we're communicating with anybody, the first thing that we need to look at is how do we build rapport by first aligning ourselves with that particular person. In other words, using language that appeals to that person's meta program, number one, using body language that will also appeal to it, and then also using the tone of voice that might appeal to it. We know that those are three important areas of communication. The words that we use, the choice of words, the body language, and of course the tone of voice that we use. So it is far quicker and more effective. The same holds true when we do with communication. Right, so let's look at one of the biggest rules when we look at rapport, or before we look at the definition. Generally, when people like when people are like each other, in other words, we are similar, then they tend to like each other. And that's actually, if you look around you, look at the friends you keep, look at the colleagues at work that you stick around, always go to for help. It's normally those people that you align yourself to. And when you align yourself to them, you find that communication with them is much easier. So when we use influencing language, we use language that will appeal to that particular person, and hopefully that person then likes us, and because they like us, you find that working becomes much easier with them, and you get them into action and to do things. So when you look at the actual definition, rapport is the ability to form a very powerful powerful common human bond and a relationship of, number one, responsiveness, and that's the action we're talking about. As you enter another person's world and help them feel that you understand and accept them. And you know, the most important thing that to every person for survival is air or oxygen. So very much like oxygen, you find that this understanding, when you build rapport, people find this what they call the psychological air that they're looking for, the psychological oxygen that they're looking for, because it opens their mind and breaks the barrier to communication. So influencing them becomes more easier if you build the rapport first. So let's look at the differentiation between attitude and motivation again. And remember, for this purpose of this seminar, we're talking only about the motivational traits, but you have to understand there are also attitudinal traits. And those attitudinal traits are the working attitudes. So if you look at the difference, motivation can be seen as the inner stimulus, so what makes us do what we have to do, and the attitude can be observed from the outside. So that's just a recap. So let's look at some of these motivational traits that we're going to discuss now. If we look at the very first meta program that I'll discuss, and in total you talk about the lab profiling assessment, which is normally done. There are in total 6. As I mentioned, for the purpose of today, we will discuss only 5 of them. The first one is the action motivation. So after an assessment is actually done on an individual, whichever assessment you decide to choose, and I'll give you a choice at the end, you would find out what action motivation is, particularly for that individual that you're working with. So action motivation is doing versus thinking. Now, please don't get me wrong, because it's not about whether a person is a doer or a thinker. It's more in terms of what is the person's level of action. In other words, the amount in time a person takes to engage in an activity. And there are 2 particular ends of the pole that we look at. The one is a person can either be a proactive person or he can be a reactive person. In other words, a starter or a follower. But you can be in between as well. So depending on the outcome of the test, you'll be able to identify what that person is. So if we look at a proactive starter acts with little or no consideration. In other words, they're motivated by just doing. So these are the people, and you might recognize yourself as I'm speaking and going ahead. These are the people that when they're confronted with a decision to be made, or when they're confronted with something to do, they just jump in and they actually do it without even thinking about it. And possibly sometimes down the line, they might actually find out that, oops, I made a mistake. I should have reflected first. But these are the proactive starters. Sometimes they're very good at it, and sometimes they might mess up a project, depending on where they're at. Then, of course, you have the reactive, who's the follower. They're motivated more to wait. They analyze things, they consider, and then they react based on that. So when we look at the action motivation is, do you take action when a problem occurs, or don't move until you are forced to? The action filter, this meta program filter, if you analyze and you identify it as either proactive or reactive, then the action filter describes how much urgency or energy you feel to make changes. On the other hand, it also describes how much of reflection you give to a situation. So let's divide this into 2 things now. One is the work context of what kind of work people do with regards to whether they are proactive or reactive. And of course, what kind of language can be helping them in their situation. So for those of us who believe, or after we've done a test to analyze whether we're proactive or reactive, is when in a position, for example, for proactive, when they are in a position that they can initiate a task or activity, they don't have to wait for others. You'll find they'll just go in and they'll initiate it. And these are generally our project starters. These are the guys who will actually get in and get their hands dirty as quickly as possible. They don't have the need to analyze, and they obviously don't, the task that they have, they want to do it up front and as quickly as possible. So those of you who are dealing with these kind of people, for example, if you're a salesperson and if you've identified your actual client to be, for example, a proactive, and there are very easy ways in communication that you can find this out, but when you do, and you do find out that he is proactive, then you would like to use languages from an influencing perspective. For example, is don't wait for the rest of things to happen. Here's an opportunity for you to actually make it work. That kind of language will help that person to be influenced. A leader, for example, who is going to be leading a team and you want them to start a project immediately, if he knows that a majority of his team members are proactive and they're quick at starting, you'll find that he will want to say things like, you can start the project now and you can later brief the rest of us of how far you are. So you'll find that it immediately gets people that are proactive into jumping in and doing an actual task. So the kind of words that you will be using is very proactive. Somebody comes up to you and says, you know, I have this job that you've asked me to do, but I'm not 100% certain. And if you know that this person is generally proactive, you would say, you know, do what you have to do to get the job done, and we can discuss it later. It motivates the person to say, jump in, get it done, let's learn from the mistakes, and let's actually move on. So it gets people into action. Whereas let's look at the lower part, which is the reactive. The person who rather is motivated to wait. So if we use that and we know that this person is motivated to wait, analyze, consider, we might want to use words like, for example, I suggest you study the proposal first before you make a decision. And I'll call you tomorrow once you have liaised with others. So here you find a very strong preference for that person coming up. So as salespeople, if you've identified, and through lab profiling assessments that we can teach and coach, you can identify through a very casual conversation whether a person is proactive or whether a person is reactive. And if you identify that he's reactive, you might want to use that terminology. I suggest you consider this first before you do that. Think through the proposal before you actually react. And you find that those things would actually motivate the actual learner. All right. So if we now move on to the next direction, or the next motivation, it is called the direction motivation. And the direction motivation is based on problem solving versus goal orientation. So if you look at problem solving, is a person's motivational energy centered on achieving goals, which is goal-centered, he is towards things, or is it away, towards avoiding problems? And you can see the two poles on your screen, goal orientation and problem solving. So to quickly look at that, the person has trouble recognizing problems. He's good in managing priorities because he's looking forward. He's a towards person. He doesn't want to deal with any problems or any issues. And if you recognize that as his characteristics, then you know he's a towards person. And then, of course, you have the problem solving, which is away from. They focus on potential problems. They're motivated to solve problems. Now and I'm sure some of you can actually identify them as you're sitting there behind your screens. You're identifying people who is energized by, give them a problem and they love it. So those are things that will motivate them. Give them things to solve. Give them issues to be able to resolve. And you become motivated by that. So when you look at the meta programs on this particular profile, it determines the type of consequences that are likely to move us into action. So if I'm speaking about goal orientation, then it will move me into action when I speak positive words towards goal orientation. And for a person who is a problem solver, we talk about problem orientation. In other words, what is going to move that person to be motivated to solve actual problems. So at some level, if the reward or potential is a pleasure, which is big enough, or the consequence or potential pain is bad enough, everyone will move towards or away from. And the theory X that we all know in terms of motivational theories and theory Y is very much like this. We know the carrot and the stick. The question is, even though we know this, the language we use is not reflective on that. So when you talk about the carrot and the stick, if we're trying to motivate somebody with a carrot and his profile tells us that he's a problem solver, he's not going to be motivated. You need to be able to reward in terms of the stick from that particular perspective. Now, I'm not talking about physical sticks, and those of you who are in various leadership programs, you laugh at the idea of a carrot and stick. So, for example, the person who is goal-orientated, we will talk about, you will benefit from doing this because you will get X, Y, and Z. We talk about how they look towards goals and orientation. For the person who's a problem solver, you can actually talk about, in order for us to prevent last year's mishaps, I recommend we do X, Y, and Z, because this person will want to move away from mishaps, will want to solve problems. So the language we use is matching. And remember, we're talking about martial arts Aikido. We're aligning ourselves to the preference of that person, and we're redirecting them to actually do something. So we will tell them, in order for you to reduce the cost on last year, we recommend that the following things are placed into effect for this year. As opposed to a person who's goal-orientated, we might change our words by saying, guys, next year our goal is to be able to get X amount of sales, and therefore we will reduce the cost. We're saying the same thing, but if we look at the mannerism in which it is said, it is very different. And if you look at, for example, Mother Teresa, and although I'll discuss that a little later, I'm just going to jump to that particular slide so you can see it, is that, sorry, when you look at Mother Teresa, for example, we talk about positive language versus negative language. Mother Teresa was once approached and she was asked, would you join us for a walk against war? And her reply was, no, I can't. But when you have a walk for peace, please do ask me. Now, if you look at that, they're both saying the same thing. A walk against war and a walk for peace. You have positive versus negative language. Now, in history, before we knew about meta programs, we would have said, well, it's positive because she said a walk for peace. But in actual fact, if we go back to our meta program, in terms of the motivation, she was speaking more in terms of goal orientation as opposed to problem solving. But if we look at a person that she was speaking to, if that person was motivated by problem solving, they might not be impressed. But if that person was motivated by goal orientation, they would have been her best friend. So it's the mannerism, the attitude, and of course the motivation behind what is being said. And again, if we move on to the third motivational characteristic, and that is source. In other words, where do we actually make our decisions from? Does it come from within yourself, or does it come from external factors? So, does the person's judgment in terms of his or her action come from inward or outward? In terms of internal, they decide based on their own internal standards. External, they need outside feedback to know how well they are doing. So, in other words, if somebody had asked me how do you know, for example, and this, by the way, is from a lab profiling test, is how well do you know, or how do you know you do a good job? And I would just answer, is because I know it from inside. And if the person's, and if my response would have been, well, I actually wait for feedback from my audience, then that would actually be able to tell me is, where do I base my judgment in terms of my decisions? Do I make those decisions internally, or do I wait for external? When we look at this particular motivation, are those decisions inward or outward? So a salesperson, again, that would be very interesting for you to know, is that if we know that a customer is internal, then that is where their source is going to be from. Their judgment is going to come from them. And it's about convincing them, so allowing them to make the decision there and there. But if it is external, numbers, they love to read those kind of things because the decision comes from outside, as the example that I used earlier on. Internal, we might want to tell them that this is something for you to decide about. If the person is internal, subject that you're talking about or information, and you would say, look, this is my findings, this is what I found out, but I'd like your opinion on it. You're the best at making these judgments. So using language like you the best, you only know, something for you to consider and then decide. Things like what you know best for things in this situation, but here's my opinion on how it can run. You are using hot buttons of an internal The last two that we're going to look at is the reason, motivation. For example, please follow this procedure. It's very difficult for them to do because they want to have different options. So you might go to them and say, this is the process and the procedure. Have a look at it and tell me what you think and how you think we can amend it and adjust it. Because it allows for them to have options. A procedural person, on the other hand, would love the procedures. They just want to get the procedures and run with it. So the procedure person prefers to follow set ways, and they're stumped when they don't get those particular procedures. For them, the influencing language we would use as, these are specific steps that are required, the right way to do it and the wrong way to do it. So do this first, do that second, do that third. And that will follow for a procedure thinking profile. But a person whose options, you would give him the procedure and you would say, please be free to look at it, make amendments, and if you would like to adjust it and change it, let me know. So it gives them the option to think about it. And then, of course, the last one that we look at is how do we create a relationship motivation? What's our relationship with things? And this, in other words, this preference has to do with the person's need or urge for change. For all the HR recruiters out there, this is one of the most important preference for you, is identifying how consistent a job is and matching that person's preference to it. Because if a job is going to be very consistent without lots of changes, a person who's a sameness person, for example, would love it because it's going to be consistent. And you'll notice on the screen that a sameness person provokes change only every 15 to 25 years. An evolution person, for example, is they prefer situations to evolve slowly over time. They may want to major change every maybe 5 to 7 years. But of course, a person who likes change, they want everything to be, they want change basically to be constant. They may, the changes that they go through is every 1 to 2 years. So if you're looking at the actual language there, is with people that you are trying to motivate for change and they are a sameness person. If they've been identified with a profile as sameness, then words that you might want to use is, for example, what we are going to progress or show you now is very similar to what you've done in the past, and you have a few additions that are added to it. So you have to link what they know well because it's the same, and then give them the actual differences. And you'll find that that kind of language starts to stimulate their mind in terms of very difficult because Microsoft Office 2004, 2000, Microsoft XP, whatever it is, I don't want to change. When they come up with something, oh, it's brand new, it's new concepts, it's new terminology, immediately I'm stumped and I don't buy. And the reason is because I'm used to that particular sameness. But if their marketing and if their kind of language that they would use is, it's very similar to what you are using, only we have enhanced it with X, Y, and Z, which will make your work easier compared to how you are doing it at the moment. That kind of language would help much more. And that's, of course, the relationship motivation. So that's positive language versus negative language, speaking about Mother Teresa. And looking at this, you've all seen this before, is that we say that 7% of our message is verbal, 38% is pointers, and 55% is language. In other words, that's the amount that influences the other person. But if we use the profile and understand the profile of the person, what we found is that our words only can be increased to much more than 7%. So it can be used with our vocal pointers and with our body language, but the choice of the words we use can influence the person if we understand their meta programs in terms of what we've just looked at and discussed. So while your information is working on the conscious mind of another person, remember your physiology, your voice, and your mode you are in are working on their subconscious. And the mode that we're talking about is that influencing language, which is working on the subconscious mind of the individual, because that's part of the meta program that we're looking at. So sometimes you might even look at, well, people actually like you without even knowing why. And it's because you're working on a meta program that is within them. And finally, you are doing three things when you do this. You are building rapport. You are creating a frame of agreement which bonds you together. And of course, you are opening the door to redirecting something without creating resistance. So when we ask the question initially is, how do we get people to act? It's all about creating rapport by using language that matches their actual meta programs. So when we look at finally the last few areas is tools that are available particularly for this. Now, if you look at training excellence as an example, is inventory for work attitude and motivational, personal driving dynamics, organizational well-being. There's a lab profile assessment tools and tests that we do. And we basically have certified IOM professionals and lab practitioner profile practitioners that are available to be able to coach, to help. But these tests can identify exactly what the profile is of both staff, senior managers, and so forth. So once these tests are done, we can then coach in terms of the language that we use to enhance and influence people to be able to do and act. For salespeople, you would love this because it allows you through a very simple conversation with a client to identify exactly what their profile is and then use words to be able to motivate them. And as I've mentioned, for leaders, doing the assessment on the team projects, and of course, then coaching and counseling. The same would be for sales teams and of course the customers. Doing assessments on both the sales teams, coaching them, and allowing them to do an ad hoc assessment on customers without them even knowing that you're doing the assessment on them, because it's done through conversation. And then of course coaching and training those salespeople to become more effective. Human resource teams, it's looking at conducting the assessments, and then of course coaching and training again. And then last but not least, for those of us who are coaches in the environment, is how do we use some of these assessment tools on our clients so that we can coach them into action and thereby get them to do things that they really want to do. So it's motivation and of course attitude. And finally, I would like to end off that the one sure thing that we can change in this world is ourselves. Then we change the world in the way that we see it, as well as in the way that it responds to us. The challenge is not to get others to respect you. Rather, it is to become respectable through the knowledge and the skill we obtain in lifelong learning. And that is the motto in the teachings in terms of every communication model, is how do we become respectable to others. And of course, Mr. Charfaray, thank you very much. I hope that answered quite a few of your questions, and I'm now ready for question and answer. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Hawa Charfaray, for a very interesting presentation. Folks, we're open for the question and answers. If you have any questions, you can put it in the question box, or you could raise your hand. There's a hand icon on your consoles. If you click on it, you can speak to Ms. Hawa also. Let me go straight to the question box. There's a question, a short one. In your view, Ms. Hawa, what are the main reasons for demotivation?
In my views, what are the, if I could repeat, in my views, what are the main reasons for demotivation?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, when we look at motivation, motivation again is either intrinsic or it's extrinsic. So whether you are a external or an internal person, you would be able to identify exactly what creates people into action. In my opinion, and in through all the work that I've actually done, demotivation generally comes from depending on what profile you are. So something that might motivate me, for example, will not motivate a second person. So there's no one way of pinpointing where the motivation lies, whether it's going to be something that demotivates you or not. Because, example, for somebody that money is a motivator, for others it might not be a motivator at all. So you can't pinpoint it. The point that I'm actually making is we are able at this point to be able to look at every individual and identify what their meta programs are. And when we identify each person's meta program, and we're looking at a minimum of about 16 meta programs at this point, if we evaluate through a simple 20-minute exercise with them, we can identify what motivates a person into action and what doesn't. Okay, Mr. Charfaray?
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question. In today's age of information overload, what do you recommend? How should one remain expressive on the digital platforms, in particularly while writing emails? Normally, recipients are judging your expressions through the usage of words, which might be misleading. So how can we avoid such expressive correspondence?
Okay, very interesting question. Yes, absolutely. We all were living in this very digital environment. And when we look at expressive words, you'll find that people get influenced by those very easily. So always look at who your market is and your target audience. So if you're trying to write an email, for example, to your boss or your manager, and you know that that particular person is very short and to the point and just wants to get into action, then we always have to look at our audience and how we're going to write that email. So writing it down in short point form, or we can write very long expressive emails, nobody's going to read them. And when I say nobody, I'm talking about that market. So if your market is going to be, for example, a group of people in your organization and you know that they're very busy, long emails is not going to work. So it's going to be short emails, to the point, and words that are going to influence them. So we talk about positive versus negative words. One simple example in the writing technique, many of us write at the end of our email, should you have any queries, please do not hesitate to call me. Now if you look at the words, do not hesitate to call me, is already sitting in the negative. So we can very easily say, should you have any queries, please call me, and full stop. So we need to be very selective of the choice of words that we use as well. The type of colors that we use, the bold, the italic, we like to make things look fancy, but those things don't appeal to many people in the business environment. So I would recommend very precise, to the point emails and make things consistent.
Okay, thank you. We have a caller who's raised a hand, so let me go. We have Brother Mr. Sayyid Basharat Aziz. Brother Aziz, can you hear us? And can you please ask the question and introduce yourself also? Okay, my mic is mute, he's referring, so let me go straight as you have inserted the question. Okay, I'll ask on your behalf, brother. The question is, what is the best method of influence to use to get the decision in your favor among managers or peers?
I'm sorry, Mr. Charfaray, what is the best method of?
Influence to use to get the decision in your favor among the managers or peers.
Okay, so like I've mentioned in the previous presentation, if I can just go back again, if we're looking at any person that we're trying to influence, is looking at the meta programs that we're looking at. So while we're trying to influence that person, remember you have three areas of communication that's influencing. Number one, you have your voice, which is your tone of voice. Then you have your body language. And of course, you have your actual words that you're going to be using. So your choice of words has to be very positive. And when I talk about positive words that are going to influence the person into action. So one of the first things is identifying, is this person a reactive person or a proactive person? Is this person a towards person or an away person? So when I talk this language, you find that you're profiling the person. And if you profile, and it can be done very quickly within words, for example, what do you do, what kind of job actually stimulates you? When he answers, you can ask various questions to the person through lab profiling that is going to determine whether the person is one of those profiles. Now, it might sound very confusing right now, and that's because we're not understanding that meta profiles can be assessed, and you need to be coached in terms of how they can be assessed. So that's when you're talking about words only. But if you're talking about physiology and you're talking about your tone of voice, it's always about matching that person and building rapport. So if the person has a very low-paced voice, generally you would like to lower your pace. Sit in the mannerism that the person is sitting, and you're matching that person. And it's about creating rapport with that person. And this is actually working on that person's subconscious mind. For those of you who are in training fields or doing lectures, or just sit and watch, or even if you're sitting in a lecture, sit and watch your other participants. They generally all sit in the same direction or the same way. Their peers are sitting at least 3 to 4 places away from each other because they are in rapport with each other automatically. And when you want to lead them, you match that. It's about playing martial arts, Aikido, matching that and realigning it to be able to work for you. So if you are in a discussion and the person says, I like your idea and I can add value to your idea. By saying, I like your idea, you've built rapport and you have created what you call synergy, and I can add to that, as opposed to saying, but I think. But eliminates already what you've done. So using words as opposed to but and using and can also build that rapport and create alignment in the actual workplace. Now we can go on talk so much about this, and I hope that briefly answered your question, but I'm always available for more interaction whenever you need.
Okay, we have one last question from Brother Matwali. The question is, where is the critical thinking, where the critical thinkers routinely apply intellectual standards to the elements of reasoning in order to develop intellectual traits to achieve figuring mind?
I'm sorry, I think I lost you there for a moment. Can you please repeat that?
Okay, where is the critical thinking? Where the critical thinkers routinely apply intellectual standards to the elements of reasoning in order to develop intellectual traits to achieve figuring minds.
Okay, so I presume, if I understand you correctly, it's about where our motivation comes in terms of reasoning. How do we reason through in terms of making decisions, and how do we reason through in terms of following procedures with regards to what you're saying? So if I understood that correctly, if we look at the very first one, which is decision making, where does that intellectual property actually comes from? It comes, if you are a decision maker and you need to make decisions from internal, then that comes from your internal source of the information you got, the knowledge you've processed, how confident you are in making those actual decisions, as opposed to whether you need to still get confirmation in terms of what that is. So whether that's internal or external, again, it boils down to identifying what is your own internal process, what is your source, your motivation. And that is why it's also important that we don't only work on profiles of others, but we work on our own profiles. Because if I'm always internal, it allows my mind to open up the possibility that I could be wrong, and I should be able to analyze what others are actually thinking. Whereas the other, in terms of reasoning, the motivation is, are we the type of people that like to look at options, or are we procedural? So your question reflects particularly about when we're looking about procedures and processes. If we are procedural, you'll find that we will resort to being more procedural. There will be a common way of doing things, and it will always be done that way. And because of that, a manager who's trying to influence me has to understand that I need to give this person steps and procedures, and give them dates, and give them deadlines, give them things that they are familiar with. Whereas when I'm influencing somebody who's more open to options, I'd rather give you the procedure, but I would ask you to be able to create or recreate it. So where does that knowledge actually comes from? It comes from actually you identifying through some of these assessment tools. What kind of meta program do you have? What suits you? And when you find your preference, then to look at what those hot buttons are and how you can change to various situations and context. Thank Mr. Jeffrey.
Okay, thank you very much.
I hope that answers the question.
That really brings us towards the end of the webinar. I know we have some more questions, but request the participants if you can reach directly to Ms. Hawa Charfaray for any further questions. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give, ma'am, before we dismiss out?
I think just in conclusion, as I've mentioned, there are so many tests that are available. The psychometric test, there's what we call ecometric test. I do recommend that people do get in contact with us, find out a little bit more about the tests that can be done. They're 20-minute tests which can be done on staff, on individuals, and then work towards programs of coaching people internally of how to use the knowledge of these profiles on others as well. So I have my details up on screen. They will be up there as well. So all of you who are interested in more information on this, please contact the Madinah Institute for more information about myself, and I'm quite happy to help and assist you and coach you, and I look forward to meeting some of you soon.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffrey, for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you indeed. I would like to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MAD, for a very interesting presentation that you've delivered today live with our audience. And thank you everybody who participated in this webinar. We are recording it. Please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org to access the recorded version. Next